Good afternoon. Welcome to ISS, and thank you for coming to today's seminar on what happens next in Zimbabwe. I think many of us were very caught up in the events of the last 3 weeks and then took a breather towards the end of last week, but it's time to get back to work, I think. And we're very fortunate to have with us today a very illustrious panel, 3 people who know a lot about Zimbabwe and who have very well-informed views about the kinds of challenges that Zimbabwe now faces. I think the key challenge that we want to ask, the key question we want to ask today is Zimbabwe any different today than it was 3 weeks ago, aside from the fact that there's a different president? And what does it mean? What are the key challenges ahead? What are the things that should be done? And do we think that they will be done with regards to the economy, with regards to political freedoms, with regards to changing certain aspects of the Constitution, or, and various other different questions that we have? My name is Stephanie Walters. I'm the head of the Peace and Security Research Program. We have with us Derek Matishak, who is ISS's senior researcher working on Zimbabwe and based in Harare. We have Brian Kagoro, a constitutional law expert who lives in both Johannesburg and Harare. And we have Piers Pigu, the Zimbabwe analyst for the International Crisis Group. I want to thank all 3 of you for coming today. I really am very happy that we are able to host you here. To our online audience, thank you very much for joining us. The initial part of this talk will be open. We will then terminate the live webcast once we've had the presentations from our panel, and after that the question and answer period will be under Chatham House rules. Before I turn over to Derek, who's going to speak first, followed by Brian and then Piers, I do want to thank our core donors, the governments of Australia, Canada, Denmark, Finland, Ireland, Japan, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, the US, and also the Hans Seidel Foundation. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Derek. We have 2 hours, and I know all 3 of you have a lot to say, and I'm sure there are many questions. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming, and for those of you joining us online. One of the things the succession crisis in Zimbabwe has obscured is the pending economic meltdown in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe has been inching its way or moving towards the economic precipice, and the only thing that's really in doubt is the speed at which it's been headed towards that precipice. This is something of which the politicians in Zimbabwe have been well aware, and particularly the finance minister. The finance minister knows that over 90% of government revenue is going on civil servant salaries. The situation is clearly unsustainable. And in order to try and meet government expenses, government has been creating cyber money through the issuance of treasury bills, basically. And of course, with the disappearance of the cash, US dollar cash in the system, more and more cyber money has been created, and the creation of that additional cyber money, of course, has a hyperinflationary effect, thereby reducing the real value of salaries for civil servants, and that would include the military, who get paid in cyber money, in virtual cash, which is reflected as a balance in their bank accounts, but the cash does not in fact exist in reality and can only be used for electronic transfers. With the value of this cyber money decreasing rapidly and taking a massive plunge on the 22nd of September, the purchasing power of the salaries is greatly reduced and continues to be reduced. If Grace Mugabe had not acted as the catalyst for the coup that took place on the 14th, 15th of November, it is quite possible that the coup would have taken place once one got to the stage where the military salaries could not have been met. Chinamasa, of course, was trying to deal with the situation by endeavoring to engage with the IFIs, the international finance institutions, and with Western donor countries to try and engineer some sort of bailout for Zimbabwe. This re-engagement strategy was largely being driven by what was known as the Lacoste faction, Mnangagwa's faction within ZANU-PF. And it seems that it became apparent to President Mugabe that the Lacoste faction was gaining a considerable amount of power and clout through this re-engagement strategy. And if you look at the cabinet reshuffle, the last cabinet reshuffle that President Mugabe did before he was deposed, I think that took place on the 9th of October, or thereabouts in early October, the people who were removed from their positions within cabinet, Chinamasa, Mapfumira, the Labour Minister, and Mnangagwa himself, were the people behind the re-engagement strategy, trying to deal with the financial crisis and the economic crisis they could see brewing in Zimbabwe. So for about 2 years before the coup in Zimbabwe, Lacoste and Mnangagwa had already presented themselves as the economic pragmatists, the people prepared to deal with the reality of the economic situation in Zimbabwe. But it also seems that Mugabe was intent on sabotaging their attempts at economic pragmatism. So at the very moment, and I don't speak metaphorically, at the very moment that Patrick Chinamasa was sitting across the table with the representatives of the International Monetary Fund in Lima, announcing that he was going to reduce the wage bill of government, Mugabe was announcing and reversing Chinamasa's policy of getting rid of the 13th check for civil servants. It looked like a deliberate attempt to try and sabotage that re-engagement with the IMF. So you had this tension already within government of the economic pragmatists versus Mugabe's completely irrational economic policy, or a policy where Mugabe completely ignored economic considerations. Mugabe, of course, famously said that he had never heard of a country going bankrupt. And Chinamasa and Mnangagwa were making efforts to try and deal with the problems caused by the utterly irrational indigenization policy that had been brought in by Mugabe. But the result of this 2-year period really was that Lacoste had managed to establish themselves as the economic pragmatists, and it was thought that in the event that Mnangagwa took over from Mugabe, that there would be some sort of economic reform, or at least not the economic lunacy that had characterized the Mugabe administration. At the same time, Mnangagwa was presenting himself as the economic pragmatist, he was doing some very unfortunate things with regard to governance and human rights. And two of these steps taken by Mnangagwa stand out. The first one received insufficient publicity in Zimbabwe and didn't secure the attention that it deserved. And that arose out of an attempt by Mnangagwa to protect two of his allies, two of his Lacoste allies, Munyaradzi Kereki and Johannes Tamana. Johannes Tamana was the prosecutor general. In a country where the criminal justice system has been repeatedly abused for political purposes, the position of prosecutor general is of vital importance. At that stage, Johannes Tamana was trying to protect Kereki from a private prosecution. What Mnangagwa did to try and rescue Tamana, because several court orders had been granted against Tamana, requiring him to issue the documentation to allow a private prosecution against Kereki to proceed. And Tamana had refused to implement those court orders. Mnangagwa sought to rescue both Kereki and Johannes Tamana by bringing forward legislation to Parliament, removing the right of a private prosecution in Zimbabwe. And he successfully steered that legislation through Parliament. Once you remove the right of a private prosecution, the independence of the prosecutor general is severely undermined. And that's exactly what Mnangagwa managed to achieve. At the same time, the National Prosecuting Authority was being increasingly militarized to the extent that now something in the order of 60% of the administrative staff at the National Prosecuting Authority have been seconded unconstitutionally from the military, and there are military officers within the National Prosecuting Authority. But this was part and parcel of institutional capture by Lacoste, which in fact was detailed to some extent by Jonathan Moyo in his famous Politburo presentation on the capture of institutions to the Politburo and to Mugabe, which seemed to have fallen on willing ears, if I can put it that way. The second and more widely publicized and retrogressive steps taken by Mnangagwa was, of course, Constitutional Amendment number 1. Zimbabwe's new constitution had only been adopted fully on the 22nd of August 2013, and already ZANU-PF sought to use their two-thirds majority in parliament to amend the constitution. And the nature of the amendment was of vital importance. The new constitution had attenuated the presidential powers over judicial appointments. Without a fully independent judiciary, most other democratic structures collapse and your separation of powers collapses. And we had seen that happening under the Mugabe government when Mugabe had full powers of appointment over the judiciary. The new constitution removed Mugabe's plenary powers over judicial appointments and replaced it with an interview process, a public interview process, where the Judicial Services Commission shortlisted candidates which were then sent to the president for selection. Mnangagwa introduced legislation which would allow the president to appoint the Chief Justice of the country, the Deputy Chief Justice of the country, and the Judge President of the High Court. It's fairly certain that at that time, Mnangagwa, as being responsible for the Ministry of Justice, felt that he would be able to influence the appointment of the Chief Justice, a position which had fallen vacant on account of the retirement, the superannuation of then Chief Justice Chijga Usiku. As it turned out, the legislation did not get through Parliament in time, and Mugabe appointed Luke Malaba as the Chief Justice on the basis of that interview process and a shortlist which had been sent to him. But Mugabe took no steps to fill the position of Deputy Chief Justice. Mnangagwa now has the opportunity as president to utilize his own legislation to appoint the Deputy Chief Justice. It is quite likely that he will put in as Deputy Chief Justice one of his key judicial allies, George Chiweshi, the current Judge President at the High Court. And the judicial system has been corrupted to some extent through procedures introduced by the former Judge President who became Chief Justice, Godfrey Chijga Usiku, so that instead of cases being allocated on a roster basis, the Judge President determines which judge will hear which particular case. So the Judge President wields an enormous amount of power over the High Court. So what we are likely to see happening is that Mnangagwa will appoint his ally, Justice George Chiweshi, as Deputy Chief Justice, and will appoint another ally at the High Court, Justice Charles Hongwi, as Judge President. And in this way, Mnangagwa will have considerable control over the judicial system in Zimbabwe. So what I'm saying is that as we enter the so-called new era, what is like a new dawn but the same sun, we have Mnangagwa presenting himself as the economic pragmatist and reformist, but his track record as far as governance is concerned is precisely as uninspiring as one might, or even more uninspiring than his claims to be an economic pragmatist are inspiring. So although when he made his inaugural speech, he made all the right noises, all those noises pertained to the economy. They said nothing about governance. And we are fully aware that Mnangagwa has been at Mugabe's side for the last 50 years. He has basically been Mugabe's fix-it person. Not only is Mnangagwa regarded as tainted by the ethnic cleansing that took place in the Gukuruhundi period in Zimbabwe, Mnangagwa is also regarded as tainted by the violence that took place in 2008 when Mugabe lost the presidential election. And that then brings me to the last thing I want to talk about, which is the no-coup aspect of the military intervention in Zimbabwe. Everybody seems to be eager to airbrush the word coup out of the military intervention that took place in Zimbabwe. There are good reasons for this. If Zimbabwe's economy is to recover and to be subject to immediate rescue packages, which it appears to need, the word coup needs to be avoided because there are certain international instruments and protocols that will kick in and have severe repercussions if it is admitted that a coup took place in Zimbabwe. So, for example, the African Union Charter, or one of the protocols thereunder, indicates that any country that has undergone an unconstitutional change of government is automatically suspended from the Union, and SADC has taken the same approach. We saw that with Madagascar, an automatic suspension from SADC with concomitant economic repercussions. So everybody seemed to want to avoid the word coup. Did a coup take place in Zimbabwe? There was not a coup in the sense that the head of the military took over, announced himself to be in charge of the country where the constitution was suspended and martial law was imposed. So what some people call a hard coup did not take place in Zimbabwe. But if you look at a generally accepted definition of a coup, the idea that the military intervenes in an unconstitutional manner to ensure that their person or their favored person takes over the government, then there has most certainly been a coup. And it's not the first post-independence coup in Zimbabwe. It's the second one, because the first coup took place in 2008 when Morgan Tsvangirai won the presidential election, and there was unconstitutional military intervention to secure that Mugabe remained in office. And the lawyers might like to have a look at the African Union Charter, which talks about an unconstitutional change of government. What about the unconstitutional retention of government following intervention by the military? So I would suggest the African Charter needs a little bit of tweaking there, as does the SADC policy. The military quite clearly violated the Constitution. It violated the Constitution by openly declaring that it was interfering in the party political affairs of ZANU-PF. It violated the Constitution by the military being deployed without presidential permission. And it violated the Constitution by exercising police powers and arresting people and holding them in custody, incommunicado in most cases, without bringing them before a court of law. So there was clearly an unconstitutional intervention. Things get a little bit more vague when you ask, did that unconstitutional intervention result in the change of government? Because the change of government appeared to follow constitutional requirements through that impeachment process. But it's very obvious that the impeachment process would not have taken place without the prior military intervention. What happened after that is we saw the Lacoste faction and Mnangagwa seeking to get judicial approval for the coup that had taken place. So we had a remarkable judgment issued by George Chiweshi, who I mentioned earlier, the Judge President of the High Court, issuing an order by consent, which is also remarkable, issuing an order by consent in which the parties agreed, theoretically two antagonistic parties, and the applicant to the court had asked for a declaration that what the military had done was in accordance with the Constitution and in accordance with Section 212 of the Constitution. And the Judge President said, by consent it is agreed that what the military did was constitutional. It's a nonsense judgment from a jurisprudential point of view. But it shows how Mnangagwa's capture of the judicial structures results in these kind of judgments. And it makes it clear that the judges are fully aware of what will be required of them under the Mnangagwa administration and are prepared to continue with these judgments which are based not on law but on politics. We also saw, again from the same judge, again through an order by consent, a declaration that Mnangagwa had been unconstitutionally dismissed from government. Once again, more a political than a legal judgment. And then finally in the lower courts, we saw a magistrate, again knowing what was expected of him politically, refusing to examine or consider the fact that people who had been captured by the military, effectively kidnapped by the military, and many of them abused while in the custody of the military, they were brought to court, and we saw the magistrates in the lower court refusing to look at that aspect of their arrest and their deprivation of liberty. In fact, one magistrate said, well, we don't know that these people were military. We don't know that they were state agents. Okay, they were dressed in camouflage uniform, but we don't know who they are. I'm only going to look at your case from the time that you were handed into police custody. And from the time you were handed in police custody, from the time you were brought to court, was within the 48-hour period provided for by the Constitution. So very much reminiscent of what had happened to Justina Makoko, who was kidnapped by the military in 2008, 2009. That kind of abuse of the criminal justice system and politicization of the judiciary looks set to continue under Mnangagwa. So to conclude then, what it seems that we are looking at in a Mnangagwa future is an economic pragmatism, but an economic pragmatism combined with continued repression, continued poor governance. And that is not what Zimbabweans were looking for or looking towards in the future. And it's not what those demonstrations we saw in the city on the Saturday after the coup were intended to convey to the new administration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Derek. That was a very thorough overview of the manipulation of the judiciary before and after the coup, and of what kinds of instruments might be used going forward. I want to hand it to Brian Kagoro now to provide us with his insights and views, and possibly also respond to Derek. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to the viewers who are joining us online. Let me start with the abstract. We've had a festival of illegalities over the last couple of days and weeks. The first is perhaps we keep saying that the military action was unconstitutional. But let me explain it. In terms of Section 212 of the Zimbabwean Constitution, the military is charged with the responsibility to protect or defend Zimbabwe, its people, its national security, interests, territorial integrity, and to uphold the Constitution. And in terms of Section 213 that Derek referred to, the deployment of the defense forces of Zimbabwe can only be done by the president as the commander-in-chief. Only he has the power to authorize the deployment of the defense forces and has the power to determine their operational use. Now, the Constitution is not vague as to what it is referring to in terms of deployment. So if you read further in subsection 2 of Section 213, it talks about deployment in Zimbabwe. The defense forces can only be deployed in Zimbabwe, in defense of Zimbabwe, or that means in defense of Zimbabwe means when Zimbabwe is under attack from a foreign power or from terrorist activities. But number 2, in support. The only other exception for domestic deployment of the military force is in support of the police in the maintenance of public order or in support of the police in the event of emergencies and disasters. Now, none of these occurred. There was not emergency in Zimbabwe because when there is an emergency, it has to be declared by the president. So the president uses the Presidential Temporary Measures Act to declare an emergency. And when there's a disaster, he would do the same. Public disorder, there was not a single act of public disorder at the time. So which takes you back to Section 208, which is whether or not the military acted solely in order to settle a factional feud, a family fight within ZANU-PF. And if it did so, which is part of what it claims it was trying to do, deal with the criminals around the president, the military acted ultra vires the Constitution. It has no business engaging in partisan political party feuds. So if we accept that the actions were ultra vires the Constitution, so we must ask the next set of questions. To what extent did these interfere with the exercise of executive authority? So in the period from the date of intervention to the date of abdication of Mugabe, the military placed him under house confinement. They claimed it was not house arrest. The military proceeded to hunt down, Terminator style, some of his cabinet ministers. So in essence, the cabinet was unable to meet. The rest of the executive either went into hiding or was unable to discharge its functions. So the only function that we understand Mugabe was able to discharge was a ceremonial capping of graduates. The very fact that he was unable to exercise executive authority raises serious questions about whether or not, in essence, when you constrain using the force of arms, the exercise of executive authority of the incumbent, you have transacted a coup. The second thing that happened, apart from the confinement of Mugabe to his Blue Roof residence and the hunting down of his ministers who had, without judicial determination, been styled or classified as criminals by the military, the individuals concerned of some of the crimes they have committed against the people of Zimbabwe. But it is simply to dramatize and to emphasize the point that there was a festival of illegalities. So if the military did not act under political or civilian authority or civilian guardianship of the presidency, under whose order was the military acting? Can the military of its own accord and without prior reference to its commander-in-chief determine that a country is under some form of threat, take such actions as they deem necessary? Where would the democratic control of that kind of unfettered discretion lie? The reason why the military is under civilian control in terms of Section 214 of the Constitution is because the president, when he determines to deploy the military within Zimbabwe, he has to report to Parliament, notify Parliament, and there's no carte blanche authority to deploy the military everywhere in Zimbabwe. He has to indicate to Parliament where in the country they are supposed to be deployed and why. There is a history to this which Derek has referred to. We have a history of unpleasant deployment of the military in the 1980s, where they were deployed within Midlands and Matabeleland, and thousands of people were either disappeared or killed. And the constitutional constraint is not one simply born out of excess. It's one that's meant to deal with a historical reality, that the president must also not have an unlimited power to deploy the military at whim. There must be a constitutional and justifiable reason for deploying the military. Now, that's the one set of illegalities. Now, then there was an impeachment. Now, the grounds for impeachment were interesting. I was waiting for them to go through, although as citizens, we were all happy to see Mugabe's back. It is useful that we do not end up saying the end justifies the means. Let me explain this. You needed to demonstrate that Mugabe had either acted in violation of the Constitution and his mandate as president, or that he lacked capacity. Herein lies the problem with the argument of the military and others had raised. They constantly referred to Mugabe as the commander-in-chief, that they would defer to him, that he was in charge. Now that's inconsistent with the claim of incapacity, because a claim of incapacity suggests that he is either mentally incapable, physically incapable to discharge, that he is gone insane or is now a cabbage. Sorry to use such strong words. So in this particular instance, they were at pains to show Mugabe as a normal president in charge, capping graduates, making speeches, negotiating with the general. So the incapacity component would fall away. But there was also, if you go onto the internet, some of the people who were loudest in state claiming that Mugabe was now incapable had just a week or a month or 3 months prior said there is no other candidate. There's one center of power. So they would have had to demonstrate an intervening incapacity from the date on which they had made these claims that Mugabe would be the flag bearer of the party, that they were all 100% behind him, and the date of the impeachment. So that left the ground of acting contrary to the Constitution. So part of the allegation is he permitted his wife to chastise public officials when she is not a member of cabinet. Now, which is extraordinary, particularly for the following reasons. When Joyce Mjuru was fired from government, the same officials who were now raising this as a breach of the Constitution had in fact commended Mrs. Mugabe. I refer in particular to now President Emmerson Mnangagwa. He commended Mrs. Mugabe for the vitriolic attack she had undertaken against Joyce Mjuru, who was at the time vice president. But there's a second reason, that perhaps people were better advised not to pursue the acting outside the Constitution. I know that for all the things you've listened to, this may not have arisen, but this was key to part of the negotiations that went on behind closed doors. So if you refer to Section 216 of the Zimbabwean Constitution, the Chief of the Defense Forces, which means Chiwenga, or anybody else, can only serve for a term of no more than 5 years. And where there is an extension, it should be for no more than 2 terms. Now, you may not know this. Chiwenga was appointed in December 2003. That would mean that his term of office ended in December 2013. Mugabe indeed did act extra-constitutionally by reappointing the Chief of the Defense Forces every year up to now. Mugabe did act extra-constitutionally by reappointing the Commissioner General of Police every year up to. Whatever his reasons were, it would have been very entertaining to have Mr. Mugabe plead guilty to acting unconstitutionally. If he had done so, it would have nullified the very office that the prime mover of the takeover occupies. It is curious what Mr. Mnangagwa will do, since he intends to act constitutionally with respect to these unconstitutional extensions of term of office. That's another set. Now, let's go to a component of the impeachment. Now, a lot of the lawyers somehow, I maintain that it is good to have a new president. We've had one for too long. But the appointment of Mr. Mnangagwa as president was based on a constitutional problem or lack of understanding. The Constitution is not unclear about there not being a right to recall a president. It is very clear on that. There is no right in our Constitution. If you go to Schedule 14, it's Articles 1 to 6, there's no right of recall for the president. Now, it is clear who would have taken over had Mugabe resigned or died. It would have been the last person who acted as vice president, which would have been Mpoko. Now, Mpoko was out of the country. In terms of the Constitution, that does not bar him. He had been fired from ZANU, but in terms of the Constitution, that did not bar him. Because in terms of Section 14, that's Schedule 6, Section 14 of Schedule 6. It says the following. Let me read it for you. It says the vice presidents, it says, without delay, the person elected as president in any election must appoint no more than 2 vice presidents who hold office at his or her pleasure. So the only person who could have rightfully, at the time, recalled Mpoko or fired him could have been Mugabe himself. The very fact that we extraordinarily managed to move to the next paragraph, which is the party's entitlement to nominate, just shows that we were in a moment where this Constitution did not matter, but the political exigencies mattered. So having rested this issue around this range of illegalities of unconstitutional actions, question is, could Mugabe have consented that what the military did was constitutional? I would argue that the only way Mugabe could have done is to post facto issue a presidential order, right, deploying or confirming deployment of the military, and issue a parliamentary notice informing Parliament where the military would be deployed and for what reasons. In the absence of Mugabe post facto taking those actions, he could not have consented to, and his consent would not have constituted sufficient constitutional grounds for holding that action by the military was constitutional. So, be that as it may, we have a de facto situation which has been made de jure. We now have a new president. It seems to me that our courts have become unusually efficient. In just 7 days, judgments that we thought would be impossible to get in 10 years have been made. 5 constitutional judgments out of the High Court in 7 days, that's phenomenal by any standard. Diaspora persons who are of mixed parentage, who would have been declared aliens, now can register as voters. Of course, the vice president was unlawfully fired, as we hear. The coup was not a coup, as we now understand. And we have not seen the end of these judgments. We are in high noon when it comes to public relations. Masipula's toilet described this as normalization of the abnormal. And this morning, early morning, I tweeted to my friends that anything that has to be over-marketed smacks of Hong Kong democracy, right? In a sense, it is important for us to understand that there were no illusions amongst the pro-democracy activists that the ZANU-PF power machinery would be sent packing purely through an electoral process. There was a belief among some of us that there was need to hive off components of the establishment, and that there would be a process that would enable, a democratic process that would enable components of the ZANU remnant and the pro-democracy forces, at least in a phase of transition, to form a government. That belief has always existed for the following reasons. The country's attachment to the nationalist ideals or nationalism may not be one shared by the majority of the population, which is the young, under the age of 64. But it is the one shared by those who control the economy and who control coercive arms of state. And in the business of transfer of power, it was important to negotiate the two interests in two generations. The generation that was interested in legitimacy born out of delivery and performance, and the generation that felt that it was owed gratitude for the sacrifices it made for the liberation of the country. So that's the one thing. So the Mnangagwa presidency presents, for me, an opportunity as well as a risk. You have pointed out the risks. The one fundamental risk is Mnangagwa is above the age of 75. If he were in Uganda, there would be demonstrations against him standing for office. But it is Zimbabwe. We're used to our elders running the state. So we have a sense of comfort in gray hairs. But so Mnangagwa's cabinet is likely to be average age 65. According to the official census, the number of Zimbabweans above the age of 64 is 4%. If the average age of cabinet is 65, it essentially means it represents the 4%, which makes it just 1% more than the white minority with whom we were grieved for holding all the power before. Second point, Mnangagwa, if he is to outlive the legacy that Derek described, would have to undertake comprehensive state reforms, not this tinkering around, get the economy, make sure that there are dollars in the ATM, arrest one or two unfortunate thieves, leave the others roaming around, bring a few business folk, have a few jobs. No. What you need is comprehensive state reforms. Comprehensive state reforms would enable the process of nation building to take place in appropriate circumstances. Tinkering on the edges places us in the place that Kenya was in 2002. We're simply postponing doomsday by a few more years. It is best to deal with the festering wounds in our nation based on differences, based on region, on tribe, and so on and so forth. And there is, of course, a serious generational issue, maybe not appropriately represented by ZANU-PF's G40, but certainly represented by the oppositional movements yearning for a much younger leadership. But for Mnangagwa to be able to carry out comprehensive state reforms, you do need pressure from an organized civil society, organized business sector, organized opposition. At the moment, the opposition is in a state where it is unable to force any form of reforms. This must not be mistaken for, and I suspect Mnangagwa and his supporters and his international backers in the UK in particular may have mistaken something. They didn't learn from Theresa May that a quick election can either go your way or go horribly wrong. The weakness of the leadership of the opposition is not the weakness of the opposition. Mugabe, despite using violence, attempting bribery, attempting unity accords, was unable to turn the vote in Matabeleland towards his side. In fact, ZANU-PF, even after gerrymandering constituencies, was unable to totally turn the urban vote towards them. Will a little better performance in the economy, better energy supply, no water cuts, give Mnangagwa the urban vote? I'm not sure. So I'd like to end up by saying that the danger we have is that the international community would rather stabilize Zimbabwe than have an unstable Zimbabwe and an unstable South Africa and Mozambique at the moment. So we are beneficiaries of external interests which are preoccupied with stability, and the pro-democracy struggle might have been shelved in the broader sense. The only thing the international community is willing to entertain right now is an election that somehow will legitimate whatever arrangement has come. For them, they had no policy towards Zimbabwe. They never have. As far as they were concerned, their policy was towards Mugabe. They couldn't stand this black man who would dare say to white people, get lost. As long as they can make a spectacle of him, their problem in Zimbabwe is resolved. It is such a shame because their policy towards Mugabe is now being superimposed as a policy towards Zimbabwe. Unless if there is a negotiation and an understanding that our country is much bigger than the acronym IMF, which means it's Mugabe's fault, there is going to be a match. The imposition of an ESAP light is not going to deal with the economic structural transformation challenges. If South Africa shows you that inequality leads to instability, Zimbabwe in its second cycle of deepening inequality and a false change would be more disastrous than South Africa. Why? Because you have taught them that if you are unhappy, you do a coup and will find a way to constitutionalize it. I would urge those who are interested in Zimbabwe to focus on what is meaningful and transformative change that includes not just war veterans and those that control guns, that reflects not only the interests of Britain and China, who are investors, but the interests of ordinary Zimbabweans, whose patience with continued marginalization, whose patience with getting trinkets might run out not in the distant future, but soon.
Thank you, Brian. That was quite spectacular. I want to pick up on your very last point, where you seem to be saying quite clearly that the international community is sort of driving the agenda and the reality, and then come back to a point that Derek made about just people going out into the streets. I mean, that's the one thing ZANU-PF doesn't control, and if it has to control it, it will be visible, and it will go against the sort of high noon of public relations. It will drag that down a bit, the image of this new era. And I'm just wondering, and maybe Piers will address this as well, whether the population will spontaneously come out into the streets again, whether that's something that you think is a possibility, understanding perhaps that this isn't really a change, or that they aren't going to get as much transformation out of it as they want. So that's just one question I'll throw out there. And then Piers, I'll hand it over to you to make your comments and respond to what Derek and Brian have said. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thanks for the opportunity to participate in this panel. It's never easy to follow two legal minds, particularly when you have a kind of a scatterbrain one such as my own. And of course, the events of the last 2 weeks have kicked up an enormous amount of dust, much of which hasn't settled, and we've been trying to make sense of a lot of these issues in a sea of speculation, fake news, misinformation, and of course a deliberate dearth of communications from those who have been central players in this what we might call a coup d'etat, what some are calling a military-managed transition or a military-assisted transition. We seem to be developing a new lexicon here. I'm not going to deal with the legal issues because I think they've been appropriately dealt with. I want to really deal with the question that we have up here, what to watch out for, and to flag some of the issues which have already been raised by my colleagues here at the table. I think one thing that we can say in relation to the legal dance that's been going on is that the theatre of legitimizing what has taken place will continue. I wouldn't even be surprised if suddenly some kind of presidential order from Robert Mugabe appears post facto, having sort of dropped on the floor and then pulled out to reinforce the legitimizing somewhere down the line. But I think that this internal process will continue. It will be interesting to see if things like the Chiweshi judgments are challenged or not, and whether anyone has an interest in doing so at this stage, and where that would come from. And we can expect that legitimizing will continue from the international community as part of their re-engagement dance as well. It's certainly in terms of large parts of the international community. It was interesting watching certain people inside the AU describe Robert Mugabe's resignation as an act of statesmanship, which was quite remarkable, really, and seemed to be dislocated from the truth completely. I think a starting point in terms of what to look out for is really content of the inaugural speech by Emerson Mnangagwa on 24th November, in which he set out a framework of issues. It's what he said and also what he didn't say, which I think help us to perhaps look at certain issues that we should be reflecting on and we should be assessing as we go forward. I would concur with Brian that this is a moment of opportunity, but one of also great risk. And I think while it's tempting to come out of the starting blocks being hypercritical of Emerson Mnangagwa, simply on the basis of his past and his relationship with human rights violations, it's worth looking at the background to the characterization of Mnangagwa as a pragmatist. I sat on a panel with Brian in Harare in September last year in which we explored the Western re-engagement strategy known as the Lima strategy and questioned really whether those that were pushing reform were real or not. There was a lot of smoke. And I asked the question, who are the reformists on that panel? Because with the exception of Patrick Chinamasa, the then finance minister and the acting finance minister now, and John Mnangagwa, the Reserve Bank governor, there was virtually no one to be seen supporting this. Mnangagwa's presence loomed in the background, supposedly as the godfather of promoting the reform agenda. But he rarely came out of the starting blocks and said anything publicly about this. Now we are moving to a resuscitation of the Lima strategy, which, interesting enough, was described by most people as either in a coma on life support or something along those lines about 6 months ago. But it can be resuscitated insofar as what it is. And what it is at this juncture is little more than putting Zimbabwe back on the track to repay its debt arrears and the possibility of opening up new lines of credit. Brian has referred to this as ESAP Light. And yes, there are strong structural adjustment components to the central tenets of the Lima strategy. And I think it defies anyone really to argue that this is the basis for any kind of broad-based sustainable economic recovery for Zimbabwe. First and foremost, it's about people getting their money back. And it's also about putting in systems in place which may further down the line open up new lines of credit and therefore new debt for Zimbabwe. This is about growing the debt, hopefully in a way in which the money that is now secured helps to stimulate economic growth. It's going to be a long time before we see any kind of real beneficiation for ordinary Zimbabweans, and certainly in the kind of structural challenges that face the Zimbabwean economy. You could ask, what are some of the immediate low-hanging fruits that the international community can glean from a real commitment to Lima, which we didn't see previously? There's an interesting problem here for Mr. Mnangagwa, because he has to cut the size of the civil service. Now, there was an interesting comment made just a few days before he was fired at the rally in Bulawayo by Kudzai Chipanga, one of the characters who's now facing charges in Harare, the former chair of the Youth League. And Chipanga turned around to Robert Mugabe in the speeches there and said, look, you put a whole load of our people onto the payroll temporarily in 2013. Please, will you make these people permanent? Now, these people have been on the payroll, and we don't know how many. The figures run up to 100, 150,000 people were put on the payroll in 2013. And they've been on the payroll for some time. They've been part of the mobilization masses and the mobilization capacity for ZANU-PF. Will these people now be cut off the civil service payroll, given we know that there's no sustainability on the current expenses from that payroll? Will that be one of the low-hanging fruit that Mr. Mnangagwa moves on? Goes to a broader question, which I think is fundamental, which is around the need that Brian has outlined about comprehensive state reform and whether or not Mr. Mnangagwa is going to be able to actually make moves in terms of delinking the party and state, which have become so enmeshed, so embedded, so part of a venal and corrupt patronage system in Zimbabwe over the years. Is he going to be able to do this effectively? Is it going to be done through a lens of power interests within ZANU-PF, which one can expect? And of course, how are we going to, and one of our challenges is to be able to follow those dynamics and to map them. There is a question, of course, that if he did this as effectively as some might like, that this would be reforming ZANU-PF out of power. And it's been interesting watching certain people ask the questions, is this a kind of a de Klerk moment for Mnangagwa? Is he going to make changes which are really in the interests of the country's long-term recovery, but would fundamentally undermine the interests of the party? It seems, in the conditions of where power lies inside ZANU-PF and the role of the military, it seems highly unlikely that he would make those kinds of steps. So I think, we can watch out for some of those big structural moves, but I suspect that there will be much more tinkering around the edges on that front. What was missing, I thought, we saw in the speech, we saw a lot of commitments which were echoing actually statements that he made just before he came back, which is about reassuring, I think, the international community, talking about issues around the rule of law as it pertains to the economy or economic interests, to property rights, to issues of compensation, those kinds of things. So those were part and parcel of what the international community wanted to hear as part of the deal in the Lima strategy. It's less, there's less traction around those issues as it relates to the selective engagement on issues of accountability, for example. It is going to be interesting to be able to see to what extent the allegations that formed the basis for the military intervention against the criminal cabal around Robert Mugabe actually end up in some kind of legal process. Certainly what we've seen with the prosecutions around Chipanga and Chombo don't relate to that. They don't warrant the kind of intervention if one was to believe that they didn't constitute a coup, but they certainly don't create the material justification for that kind of intervention. So we have to watch how corruption plays out, or should I say the anti-corruption plays out. Jonathan Moyo, in his criticisms of Emmerson Mnangagwa, were not altogether wrong when he talked about the selective manipulation of remedial mechanisms in Zimbabwe around the issues of corruption. And I think that we're likely to see a continuation of that. And we have to look at that very carefully, particularly as this is the bridge, really, or the grey area between the economic pragmatist and the governance concerns, because it's really around dealing with corruption and the mismanagement of funds and the mismanagement of revenues that we are really going to get a sense of whether this man is an economic pragmatist more so than in name. And I think an absolutely critical litmus test on that is how the Marangi investigations are dealt with. The investigations, you will recall President Mugabe throwing out a ridiculous number, I think $13 billion of lost revenue or unaccounted revenue from Marangi in 2016. An investigation was launched from the presidency, and that investigation has been stymied ostensibly on the basis that they can't access relevant company documentation because those companies are now challenging their removal from Marangi in the courts, and therefore those documents are sub judice and they can't access them. So the whole thing was frozen. How will the presidency deal with this issue? I think it is, as I said, an absolute litmus test, because there's real problems, because it would appear key members or key allies in the Mnangagwa grouping and the Lacoste grouping are compromised, as are people around Mugabe and on the other side as well. So, how do they do this? I remember having a conversation with a permanent secretary a couple of years ago when we were talking about corruption, and investigating corruption. And I said, well, why don't why isn't this being done and this being done? Surely these are indicators of commitment. And he indicated that this was not Mr. Mugabe's management style to pursue these kinds of investigations without fear or favour, that this was a management tool, essentially, these investigations. So I think we need to see how these kinds of cases are dealt with and the extent to which they are addressed or avoided, and to how that may fit into power dynamics and the management tools that Mr. Mnangagwa brings to the table. Two areas I just want to, or sorry, three brief areas I want to deal with, and then I'll shut up. There are many more issues, of course. Mnangagwa was silent on the issue of electoral reform. He mentioned that there would be free and fair elections, but this is a man that supported the line that the June 2008 elections were free and fair. So I don't think that a commitment made in an inauguration of that nature tells us anything, really. I'm curious the diaspora haven't been screaming and shouting for a vote at this juncture, that this could be a clear indication of a commitment made by the state for all Zimbabweans to participate in an election. It's worth bearing in mind that the way elections are run in Zimbabwe, and have been for many years, is about keeping most potentially eligible voters out of the process. And I think, unless we get a serious commitment to expanding the biometric voter registration blitz that's been ongoing, and that there is a proper auditing process of that, there's a proper assessment of where the data is being managed and so forth, that there is a likelihood that we may get another rerun of a suspect voters roll. I saw in the Herald today, I was being quoted by the political editor as saying that elections will never be free and fair in Zimbabwe. That's not quite what I said to the political editor of the Herald, and so it kind of amused me somewhat that the Herald certainly hasn't changed its ability to manipulate copy for particular interests. What I've said is that under current conditions, it is unlikely that an election can be made free or fair, and those conditions have been laid out repeatedly by opposition political parties, by key NGOs working with election issues. The ERC and ZESN again a couple of weeks ago put out a very simple and easy list for people to look at on what are some of the key issues to be dealt with. And we, unless we see some clear movement on that front and some political leadership on that from Emmerson Mnangagwa's executive, I think that we can be in for a very difficult election period, because while it seems likely, and it seemed likely prior to the change of events, that even with a factional battle going on, ZANU-PF was going to win an election. It seemed that their electoral machinery to a certain extent was insulated from some of those factional dynamics. They would, of course, have played out in the primary process within ZANU-PF, but the actual mobilization and the broader strategies afoot were things that both sides knew that they would benefit from ultimately. It's likely that we may see a resuscitation of those strategies again in order to ensure that the push-pull factors of who gets into an election process and who's kept out is maintained in order to ensure a Mnangagwa victory. I mean, we've heard time and time again that Mr. Mnangagwa is not a popular man, although his new double liberator moniker may stay with him for some time as part of the ongoing PR process. So elections are something I think we really need to look out for in terms of as an indicator of commitments. The second area is around reconciliation and healing considerations. There were some general platitudes thrown out, bygones be bygones, reaching out across racial, ethnic, political divides and so forth. But there's a whole listing of areas which specifically require engagements. I wonder how, for many Zimbabweans, when they hear a commitment to pay compensation to white farmers, yet nothing said around Gukuruhundi, around the victims of Murambatsvina, around the victims of Marangi, the victims of the 2008 violence, and the lists go on and on and on. So, unless I think we see some specific moves around some of these issues, I've said in some media recently, when asked about Mr. Mnangagwa's alleged responsibilities in Gukurahundi, what should he do? My suggestion is that he should embrace his responsibility for these issues. He may well be able to explain a broader collective responsibility for this. One of the things that I found remarkable about the South African Truth Commission process, and I know it's a very different story there, was the ANC's ownership of violations kind of disrupted some of the counter-narratives against the ANC at that time and was, well, first of all, unprecedented, but a very powerful contribution to a broader debate around responsibilities and what's going on. I think combined with the reparations strategy, it may be a real opportunity. But I just don't see him doing it. This is my own take on it. The last thing I want to talk about is the security sector, because, of course, that was something absent from his contribution. Security sector reform has been a sort of cry from civil society and opposition groups for some time. Of course, in these conditions, it's unlikely that Mr. Mnangagwa, with a stadium full of brass marching around as though they were on some kind of amphetamine around the stadium, and the numerous numbers of military that were placed in the stadium, it was unlikely he was going to say anything about this. It does remain a serious concern moving forward. The military have effectively said in the past, as we know, that they would not allow anyone without liberation movement credentials. To a certain extent, this was echoed in their commentary around the build-up to the coup, certainly in the statement made by General Chiwenga on the 13th of November, the day and a half before the coup, when he talked about these elements having hijacked the counter-revolutionaries who weren't part of the movement and were undermining those that were involved in the liberation movement. What does this now mean for those that might challenge Emmerson Mnangagwa successfully, perhaps, in an election, either now or in 5 years' time? Does it mean that they won't accept that? So what kind of movement will we get for strengthening oversight of the security sector? And lastly on that, I am deeply disturbed by how the police have been dealt with in Zimbabwe. They were effectively removed from operational responsibilities for a period of almost 2 weeks. They were described by Chris Musvangwa, the chairman of the War Veterans, their leadership, along with that of the Central Intelligence Organization, of having been captured by the criminal cabal. We saw Augustine Chihuri sort of wheeled out, whether he's in detention or not, we don't know, for the inaugural speech where he was booed resoundingly by the people in the crowd. Are all police in Zimbabwe corrupt? Are all police, what policing role must there now be? We certainly know the military have no training in policing. And we have this kind of unusual situation now where in some areas there's joint patrolling going on, in other areas the police are not visible. Now, at one level there's a populism to this. There's a relief given the abuse that the police were involved in, particularly around the roadblock culture. But this is not a good sign that the police have been withdrawn. And I think the biggest problem for me in this is the almost absolute silence from the executive around responsibilities about what's going on and setting a vision outside of the police are going to be brought back to fulfill their constitutional mandate. And that's a broader concern I have about what's going on at the moment, is that we see Mr. Mnangagwa releasing periodically little bits of information, statements about amnesties for externalizing money, a little bit about this, a little bit about that. This is not a reflection of a coherent government. But it's early days still. I think that's the caveat to that. We are expecting to see the announcement of a cabinet soon. That should give us an indication of some of his intentions. And then hopefully we will see some meat being put onto the bones of the policies and some of the policy areas that have been outlined in his inaugural speech. So I think it's it's very much a watch this space. I think there's a understandable cynicism behind in other people. I am kind of bemused at one level, but not surprised by the Kool-Aid drinking that's going on amongst those who think that we've reached a brave new place. I think it's way too premature to be calling those judgments. And we see that coming from certain analysts, from certain countries, from certain diplomatic communities and so forth. But I think we need to watch that. We need to be able to support, and we need to have an engagement which responds by rewarding and incentivizing progressive change, but one that also doesn't airbrush and ignore and avoid dealing with some of the hard issues, which I'm afraid was a core characteristic of the re-engagement process that we saw between 2013 and to date. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Piers. That was a really nice wrap-up. I think in particular on the question of the international community, which all of you have spoken about, and Brian, you seem to be cautioning us a little bit about perhaps their willingness to take things at face value. I mean, a question I would ask is, what do you think concretely they should be doing right now? And to what extent do they really have leverage? Is it just the economic issues? And where does the leverage of the international community bump up against ZANU-PF wanting to protect its own interests and perhaps continue in the way it has? But obviously, I want to open this up to the audience. We are saying goodbye to our online audience. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you. Bye. And for those who are in the room, please just state your name and your affiliation, and remember that this is